so much for coming. This is a wonderful gathering, and it's a salute to you, Matt, that so many are here. I'm David Gergen, and I'm representing the Center for Public Leadership. And this is Alex Jones, as all of you know, who represents the Shorenstein Center. And the two of us are proud to host this luncheon with Matt Miller. And you probably, the fact that you're here suggests you may have been seeing some of the reviews of his new book on the 2% Solution. The Washington Post Sunday Book Review had it on the front page with a big, huge review recently, and the LA Times, it just hit in the bestseller list. It's on the LA Times, and is gaining growing attention elsewhere. The New York Times is about to publish a review. We'll have to wait and see what it says, but the other reviews have been highly flattering, and it's a huge breakthrough, I must tell you, for a policy wonk with a first book and a serious book to break through like this. It is. It's a very pleasing development. Matt and I have known each other a long time. I'll tell you a bit more about that. But anyway, let me just go back to the beginning with Matt Miller and tell you just a bit more about him. I had all this information that came here. Born in New York City and raised in New York and in Greenwich. BA magna cum laude from Brown, and then a law degree from Columbia Law School in '86, where he was on the law review. He went on there to work, and it's a little unclear, Matt, where you went directly after law review. You went to work for a national chain of women's clothing stores. That must have been a fairly brief. Your marketing job. Does that account for your attire? Or is it,
That's right. No, it was actually it was women's clothing. That's right.
Women's clothing. Well, I can. And then he went on to work for McKinsey. And worked for McKinsey from '89 to '91, and in '91 won a White House fellowship, which began a real change in his life pattern. From his White House fellowship, he went on to work at OMB as in a leading management job there, and became a major figure in the Clinton administration at OMB. And he was senior advisor, the director of Office of Management and Budget from '93 to '95. Since then, he has done so many things it would be hard to read them all, but I can just tell you, it was through Jody Greenstone, who was my partner and deputy in the Clinton administration, who is now Mrs. Matt Miller, that we became friends. And I've had a chance to visit them in their home on a bluff overlooking the ocean and the Pacific just outside of LA. It's a wonderful place. And that Matt has launched a career as a public intellectual. And it's been a fascinating transition to see someone going from OMB into this role of public intellectual with a newspaper columnist now in 50 newspapers around the country. NPR with the Morning Edition doing commentaries there, frequently on television as a commentator. I think that there was a time when you were paired up with one Arianna Huffington. Was that not right?
I've done a radio show for 7 years with her, but when we started the show, she was the right on the show. It's called Left, Right, and Center. She was the right when we started the show. That was the joke in L.A. after she evolved over about 18 months from Newt Gingrich to Warren Beatty. Was the person
and based on that foundation, he's now working with John Podesta in the new think tank that, as you know, has been started in Washington. Plus, he's launched this book on the 2% Solution, and this is something Matt has been, if you've been reading his columns over the years, you've read him in Time, you've read him in U.S. News and elsewhere, you know he's one of the few people in public life today who takes policy seriously and wants to write about policy and talk about policy and get us to focus on it. And often we get people who are saying who's ahead, who's behind, who write in the media. But this is someone who really wants to get down to the innards and understand them and try to explain them. And now that he's acquiring a national audience, it's really interesting for us at the Kennedy School to think about how someone who can take policy seriously and turn it into something that really can gain a national audience. So Matt, we're delighted that you're here. Tell us about your book. And at some point, I'd like to ask you about how your advice to students who are interested in communicating in this realm. But let's go into the subject first. Alex, you have anything you want?
No. David said
he wanted to introduce, we were of course jockeying, you know. David is an old friend of mine, but I want to only say that I admire and I read your columns. I've not read your book yet, but I have certainly read about it. I look forward to it, and I certainly welcome you here as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you, David, for that generous introduction. You confessed not my secret, but that Jody and I were a White House romance before White House romance got a bad name. That's what I tell you. This is all pre-Monica. And I'm thrilled to be here at the Kennedy School because you, I guess, is it mostly students who are here, Kennedy School?
Demon fellow students,
fellow
interested
students.
people.
I mean, this is obviously one of the kinds of audiences and constituencies that I most want to reach with these ideas, trying to reframe the debate somewhat, because the debate has been, in my view, dysfunctional in lots of ways in the last decade. It's funny. I mean, the whole notion of a 2% solution, and the idea of talking about solutions, and then having what some have said is the recklessness or the craziness to actually talk about solutions that would fix America's problems in ways liberals and conservatives can love, is a little countercultural, to say the least, given the current kind of crossfire and sort of the typical propaganda war and partisanship that goes on. And I'm not immune from partisan impulses, and I wear a partisan hat a lot. And when we get into the Q&A, I hope we can talk about how you actually reconcile wearing a partisan hat and wanting your side to be the ones to have power with trying to figure out sustainable changes to our public and social commitments that, in my view, have to be done by votes of 70 to 30, not 51 to 49, which is why I've crafted the book and the approach in the way that I have. So what I'd like to do first, just to set the tone, and this is trying to bring liberals and conservatives together, is just mention my favorite quote from Ambrose Bierce on this matter, who wrote something called the Devil's Dictionary, that I'm sure you're all familiar with. He defined a conservative as a statesman who is enamored of existing evils. As a statesman who's enamored of existing evils, as opposed to the liberal who wishes to replace them with new ones. I'm on the liberal side of that divide, but that whole notion actually, in a very witty way, I think, should suggest the proper humility with which we approach these problems, because even though I'm talking about solutions in quotes, none of these problems are ultimately ever solved, but we're trying to move the ball on things that I'm convinced, and I hope a lot of people in this room care about. Let me start in a bit of a weird place by talking about luck. And when I say luck, I'm talking about the pre-birth lottery, the kind of thing that John Rawls talked about, the late great political philosopher based right here. The inherited wealth, talents, skills, family, race, health or lack of it, all these things that we come into the world with based totally on what womb we happen to come out of, and for which we can neither take credit nor be blamed. I believe, under the influence of Rawls, I guess, that this luck, which I'm calling luck, has an enormous impact on where we end up in life. And that if we took luck seriously, and this is actually the argument in the affirmative section of my book, it would help reorient public debate around the kinds of commitments we ought to have on domestic policy as a nation. Now, to get a feel for a group, I always like to ask this question, and I'll tell you in a second what Milton Friedman said to this question and what Bill Bennett said about luck. And by the way, this is, if you follow the news, obviously, you know that Bennett later had another run-in with luck that we can talk about. We can talk about separately. But I talked to him about luck in a different context before the recent unpleasantness. But the question I want to ask is, if you had to say which matters more in determining where a person ends up in life, is it luck? Which, I mean, the whole bucket of things I'm calling the pre-birth lottery, the inherited health, wealth, talent, skills, etc., or lack thereof, the education that comes with that, because, you know, your early experience in life is determined totally by the family you happen to be born into, and whether you're in Boston or Baghdad. Luck, or, on the other hand, personal initiative, hard work, individual effort, character. Now, obviously, that's a cardboard choice. In every life, it's a blend of both. We acknowledge that. But if you had to say which one matters most in terms of where people end up in life, by a show of hands, how many people would say luck? How many people would say hard work, individual initiative, personal effort? Don't be shy. It's okay. I'm not making a case against hard work. I believe in hard work. This is So it's a luck-filled room. It's a pretty big sweep for luck with some strong, committed, hard workers. I understand that. Now, this would suggest, based on the poll that I actually commissioned for the book, that this is a largely Democratic crowd. People who identify themselves as Democrats tend to believe that luck accounts for more of where you end up in life. People who identify themselves as conservatives, except for especially thoughtful conservatives like David and Bill Bennett, would tend to characterize hard work, personal initiative, etc., as the bucket that matters most. And in my view, and a hopeful result from this little poll, the all-important independent voters, which, as you know, turn any elections, tend to view luck just like Democrats do, which is an interesting fact, I think. Now, why am I talking about luck and starting here? You'll recall that Rawls urged us to think about the pervasive influence of luck in life and asked us to imagine if we were in some original position before we were born, but still able to think, obviously. So this is a thought experiment. When we were in a situation when we did not know what position in the world we would occupy, where would we be born, what kind of family, what health, wealth, etc., all those things I've mentioned, that was the right place, behind what he called famously the veil of ignorance, to decide what rules of the game, what rules by which we organize society, would be something that everyone would agree on as fair. And what he said, and which I've been strongly influenced by, is that it would drive us to two fundamental commitments: a serious commitment to equal opportunity and a serious commitment to a minimally decent life for citizens of a wealthy nation like the United States. Those two things. Now, in a kind of journey that I've been on writing this book and researching this book the last few years, I've been a kind of shuttle diplomat between the left and the right, trying to put pragmatic flesh on ways to get serious about just those commitments: equal opportunity and a minimally decent life for citizens of a wealthy nation like the United States. And so I've been talking with, and you'll hear the voices in the book if you look at it, of everyone from Bush cabinet members to the Milton Friedmans and Bill Bennetts to Milton Friedman, by the way, who's had, let me put a footnote on, Milton Friedman's had a very complicated relationship with luck, which I actually spend a whole chapter talking about how we can actually reconcile Milton Friedman and John Rawls. This is a group that would probably appreciate, might appreciate that. What Friedman did, interestingly, this is in 1952 when he was 40, not a global figure of any renown, but he has always been sort of nagged by luck as he thought about his own thoughts on political economy. And he wrote a paper in 1952 called Chance, Choice, and the Distribution of Income, where he tried to prove mathematically that the distribution of income that we observe in society is not as influenced by luck as we might intuit. So that he said, for example, our tastes and preferences and choices have as much influence. So if you choose, for example, to bask in the sun, instead of going to the Kennedy School and then getting a job at some public policy think tank, you will earn less. The sun basker will earn less than the person who chooses to go to the Kennedy School and get a job. He's right. Milton Friedman's right. And he sort of teases out from examples like that this whole mathematical theory that shows that luck is not as important in the distribution of income as we presume. Now, why was Milton Friedman at age 40 at such great pains to prove that luck isn't that important? He doesn't say so in that early paper, but I think the answer is obvious. If you're a free market economist, you cannot let luck in the door this way. Because if luck is as important in where people end up, as we intuit, as many of us intuit, and certainly in this room, then the next thing you think is society probably ought to do something to ameliorate some of the burdens of bad luck. And if you are a conservative free market economist, if you let luck in the door that way, you're on the slippery slope to serfdom. And so Friedman has always had this very complicated relationship with luck that we then tease out later. I talked to him when he was, we spent about 90 minutes in his wonderful, he has a wraparound view in San Francisco, which proves, if nothing else, that if you practice free market economics for long enough, you get a really nice apartment in San Francisco. Clearly also not totally free market because it was clearly some zoning variance. He's got the one building that, sort of goes up 30 stories in this otherwise low-rise area. But anyway, through voices like that, through conversations with the Bush cabinet, through Democratic consultants and presidential contenders whose voices are on the book, I had a very interesting dinner with James Carville in Washington, where after about 45 minutes at this restaurant that he owns in town, of me giving him the whole spiel that you'll hear in a minute on the 2% solution. He says, this is great, all this money for the working poor, which is what most of this is about. And I can't do a good Southern accent, but he then says, but you need to make it a 3% solution because healthcare always costs more than you think. Which was a very substantive, analytical remark from people shouldn't poo-poo political consultants. So it's been an interesting journey, and a journey that has also revealed these astonishing facts, which I try and include when David talks about trying to make some of these issues accessible. Some facts are so astounding I could not memorize them, and so I actually had to make a little laminated card of them. This is the uninsured, which we just saw news about the other day, right? The uninsured today, the number of uninsured, are equal to the combined populations of Oklahoma, Connecticut, Iowa, Mississippi, Kansas, Arkansas, Utah, Nevada, you have to picture the map, New Mexico, West Virginia, Nebraska, Idaho, Maine, New Hampshire, Hawaii, Rhode Island, Montana, Delaware, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, Vermont, and Wyoming. Now, does anybody think that if we had, if it's 24 states, if we segregated the uninsured and put them in 24 states, I mean virtually half the union, for those mathematically inclined, that we would ignore that problem, but because they're sort of blended in among the rest of us, maybe some people in this room are uninsured, we're the only advanced nation that lets this go on. So, kind of crazy facts. And facts, by the way, there's a whole press angle to the book that I hope will interest folks at the Shorenstein Center and others who are interested in the role of the press, because the press is so important to all of this. And in fact, the Columbia Journalism Review is excerpting in its November issue, doing a big excerpt on the whole press section of the book that I'll talk about a little more later, because I have a very concrete proposal for Len Downey at the Washington Post and Bill Keller at the New York Times about what they should do with page one, which they very graciously engaged on. But when I talked to Len Downey about things like this, just to give you a preview of it, and said, what about the uninsured? Couldn't you guys do more to give more attention to the uninsured? How about having, just even the number of uninsured more often on page one? And he goes, well, the uninsured are a part of every story we do on health coverage. It's that backdrop to everything we do. And I wouldn't put it on page one. That's a news judgment, unless there was some reason to do that. And I was saying, how often has it been on page one? He goes, well, I don't know, but that's a matter of our news judgment, and I'm not going to do it just because you want it on page one. And so, which is a reasonable point of view. But then I went and looked how often the uninsured had actually, just a fact of 40 million or so uninsured, had been on page one between George Bush's inauguration and September 10th, 2001, which was my cutoff for obvious reasons. And just the fact of the 40 million uninsured was never on page one. During that period, it was inside about 12 times. Now, during that same period, the Gary Condit Chandra Levy story in the Washington Post had 187 pieces, I think, numbers in the book, including 15 front page pieces on it. Now, obviously, no fair-minded person would look at those two stories and say they're of equal importance to the Republic, but just gives you some sense of where the discussion is, or where the press is, in terms of, for reasons that they have, that you have to be empathetic toward, they feel constrained today in terms of where things are. So I've been searching through this kind of process over the last few years for a package that might begin to reframe the debate about these basic commitments that taking luck seriously would move us toward. And this 2% solution is where I've come out. So I'm hoping to persuade you that this is the kind of direction public life should go in. And here's the pitch. Suppose I told you that for 2 cents on the national dollar, we could have a country where every American had health coverage, every full-time worker earned a living wage, every poor child had a great teacher in a fixed-up school, and politicians didn't need to spend so much time groveling to wealthy donors. Suppose I added we would achieve these liberal-sounding goals largely through conservative-sounding means, like tax subsidies for health coverage, like market-based compensation for teachers, even bigger voucher trials, and that when the dust cleared, government would be smaller than it was when Ronald Reagan was president. Now, my wager is most people would say 2 cents on the dollar, that sounds intriguing. I'd like to hear more. There's a poll in the book that I commissioned that backs that up. So then I have to explain, well, 2 cents on the national dollar means 2% of national income, or GDP, which in 2004 will be about $220 billion a year, orders of magnitude beyond the boundaries of the current Washington debate on domestic policy. Now, if you listen to the folks who set the terms of that debate, the politicians, the mainstream media, the way they interact, the usual talking heads who will usually comment on what these boundaries ought to be, they'd say, well, it's impossible. If you listen to common sense, I'm arguing, people will still say, well, it's 2 cents on the dollar. If this stuff is pragmatically doable for that, I would still like to hear more. So between our proper common sense intuition that 2% is a small number, and the Washington consensus that a 2% shift in national resources and priorities is beyond imagining, lies a chasm in which most of the quote-unquote solutions on offer from leaders on all sides, including my own Democratic side, amounts to a kind of charade. And the way we're conducting public life on these issues is a hoax. Things don't have to be this way. The 2% solution aims to show how if we take 2 cents on the dollar in ideologically androgynous ways that I tease out, we can make dramatic progress against these problems in ways that are broadly acceptable, pragmatic, and just. And the kicker to the argument is, if it seems a little audacious or outside the box, it has to be, because the baby boomers start to retire in less than a decade. And when they do, they will drain away all the cash and political energy to do anything but cope with their colossal health and pension costs. So if you think it's hard to get a discussion going now about 40 million uninsured and 10 million of these urban kids and 15 million people living in poverty despite living in homes headed by full-time workers, and as people here know, it's hard to get traction on any of this stuff, starting a decade from now, it becomes politically and fiscally close to impossible. These are problems that, in my view, take federal cash to help fix, cash that is mistakenly viewed as unaffordably liberal under existing terms of debate, but which, as a practical matter, are going to be hard to direct to these priorities if we don't build them into our vision of American society now. Now, how unserious are we today about all this? I think this is all you need to know. In the last decade, the economy has grown by 40% in real terms. During that time, the problems we're talking about, if anything, have worsened, and serious talk of addressing them has all but vanished. Our shrinking ambition is depressingly measurable. Go back to 1992, when George Bush, the father, put out a health care plan on defense. This was after Harris Wofford, you remember, won that special election in Pennsylvania, and health care was hot. The White House felt, to cover its politics, it was on defense, that they had to have a health care plan out that addressed the uninsured. And Bush put out a plan that, when phased in, would have insured 30 million out of the then 35 million uninsured. And our side said, too little, too late. We're going to get our guy in, do it on our terms. It may be understandable at the time. We know, tragically, things didn't work out. You flash forward to the current President Bush, and the outer limits of George W. Bush's compassion is a plan that, generously measured, would insure 4 million of the now almost 44 million uninsured, as we know the other day. So father was at 30 out of 35. That's where he thought he had to be politically. The son is at 4 out of 44. Meanwhile, no serious contender, there's 10 contenders, but no serious contender, in my view, for the Democratic nomination would stand behind Richard Nixon's combined plans, you can call it Pat Moynihan's combined plans, because he was advising him, for universal health coverage and a minimum family income, because Nixon's plan from the early 1970s is way too liberal for the mainstream Democratic Party today. Now, you look at these facts and you say, I say, what happened to our political will to address the problems facing ordinary Americans? And I think the short answer is simple. Since 1994, when the Clinton health care plan went down in a fiasco that cost the Democrats control of Congress, the Democrats have been scared to death to think big again. And their voices from the party you'll hear in the book. The lesson learned was it was just too risky to get out front of public opinion. And the best that Democrats could hope to do on these issues that they care about was to accompany public opinion, nudge it, follow it, but you couldn't risk going out front. Now, Republicans saw this and were emboldened by Democratic timidity and pushed harder on their traditional priorities of cutting taxes and cutting regulations, because that's what the conservative impulse in our system is. And what's been lost in this dysfunctional debate for a decade now is what ought to be this long-standing commitment to two American ideals: equal opportunity and a minimally decent life for citizens of a wealthy nation. It's where we'd be driven to if we took luck seriously in the way as I talked about at the outset. Now, how do we get serious, given that this is where we are? The case that I make for how we can get serious is simple. It's 3 basic propositions. The first is, you cannot solve these problems without money. My conservative friends are right. Money is not everything. But for the problems we're talking about, it's a lot. You cannot buy health insurance without money. You cannot lift poor workers. I'm not talking about the undeserving poor. That's a separate debate. I'm not trying to engage in that debate. I'm not saying they're undeserving either, but I'm not engaging in that debate. You cannot lift poor workers out of poverty without money. You cannot attract a better caliber college graduate to teach in our toughest urban schools without money. And you cannot offset the influence of big political money in our system without money. So the first proposition is it takes money. The second proposition is we have the money. And here I ask you to consider two numbers, 22 and 20. Federal spending as a share of GDP, share of the size of the economy, is the best measure of the size of government when it comes to spending. Under Ronald Reagan and George Bush I, federal spending averaged 22% of GDP. Under Bill Clinton, federal spending averaged 20% of GDP. Near the end, it was in the high 18s. And in ways that the press never explained, and therefore the public doesn't understand it all, we balanced the budget and then unbalanced it downward in terms of the size of the federal government compared to the size of the economy. You can credit Clinton's spending restraint, the faster growth that his economic plan produced, the Newt Gingrich and the beneficial restraint of Republicans in Congress on some spending. You can share it wherever you want. The point is, when you look at what George W. Bush is now proposing, even after epic defense increases, and Bush inherited $300 billion, he's going to be over $450 billion in defense next year. After epic defense increases, after obviously more Homeland Security spending, after 9/11, and after budgeting for a chunk, at least, you can debate the size of what the prescription drug plan should be, but for a big chunk of it's already in the budget. Even after all that, Bush is planning to hold spending at around 20% or so of GDP in the years to come because he says, quote, we've met our needs. We have not met our needs when we have the uninsured and the working poor and these other problems I'm talking about. The point of these little numbers is that 2 cents on the national dollar, even if it was done all through tax increases, which my plan does not. It's half repeals of Bush tax cuts, half tax increases, and half spending cuts and reallocations, because I'm trying to have a funding plan that Ted Kennedy and Mitch Daniels can look at and say he's honoring my values. Even if we did it all through taxes, 2 cents on the dollar would let us make dramatic progress against these problems in ways that leave us with a government at or smaller than the size it was run under a conservative Republican icon like Ronald Reagan. And when I talked to Mitch Daniels, spent a couple hours with him for the book, and you say, I know you guys can't say 22% or so of GDP is some intolerable burden on the American economy because your hero ran it at that. And they privately, of course, they acknowledge that because you can't say otherwise. So it takes money. We have the money. The last proposition is there is a deal to be made. And here, what I try and sketch out in the book, and in each of the major chapters on the solutions, I try and show how in healthcare and wages and different education areas and more, there are ways to bring left and right together around a kind of set of grand bargains, I call them, around the basic set of themes. The left has to be open to more market-friendly approaches to these problems, as opposed to just extending traditional government programs. But in exchange, the right has to be willing to pony up the money equal to the size of the problem. You can't have George W. Bush can't have a plan for 4 million uninsured when there's 44 million uninsured. Now, the good news is these kind of deals are possible. And I try and show various of our leaders in the unnatural act of being away from the TV lights and actually trying to work their ways toward the contours of a deal on these things. The bad news is that our political parties, our two major parties, are organized around ideologies and interest groups that, in my view, systematically ban the expression of a common sense blend of liberal and conservative ideas. And so the result is what I call a solutions gap in public life, where we know, if you're like me, you yell at the TV because you hear the flim-flam coming from both sides, and how many education presidents do we need to have while the schools, especially for poor kids, get worse, and the same thing on healthcare and elsewhere. People know that what they're hearing is not serious about the problems, and it creates this cycle of disillusionment where voters check out and become increasingly cynical, and it's hard to blame citizens because what else is an intelligent response when it is clear that neither party has a political strategy, a strategy for winning and acquiring power that actually includes solving our biggest domestic problems? That's a problem. So, the way I suggest that we can get serious about this is to come at our problems in a bit of a different way. Usually our leaders, and for reasons that, again, you have to empathize with, because you can't change anything in the system by trying to caricature politicians, for example. This is not an anti-politician book. I like politicians. I think you wouldn't be at the Kennedy School if you didn't think politics was one of the most important ways you can actually contribute to society. It's indispensable. But the way it works is that our political leaders typically try and address problems or pretend to address them by saying, what can I do that'll bring my ideological allies and donors and interest groups along with me? Now, there's a built-in virtue to that approach, which is that there's a built-in constituency for the pseudo-answer you develop. The problem, of course, is it is a pseudo-answer, which is why we end up with a succession of education presidents and other initiatives that sound like they're going to be great and that end up changing very little on the ground. What I'm urging in the book is, common sense, is to just try and look at our problems in a different way. And this is by way of trying to create a constituency that will make the world safe for our leaders to try and talk about problems in a different way, which is to say, you look at the problem head on, what's the best way to come at this? When you do that, you usually end up with a pragmatic blend of stuff from left and right because you're just trying to figure out what might work. And these kind of approaches, I think, are the kinds of things that would get traction. I mean, one of the reasons that I wrote the book, and as anyone who's written a book knows, you have to have a good motivation to sit down and actually make it happen, is a frustration that you couldn't find anywhere on offer in the debate something that actually tried to blend these ideas to see if you couldn't start a conversation and begin to create a constituency that in turn would make the world safe for a discussion of this stuff. Let me give you two examples of the initiatives I'm talking about, and I'm happy to talk more in Q&A and discussion to give you a concrete feel of the kind of policies I'm talking about. On schooling, and the concern of this book is about schools for poor children. There's probably 100 things the nation should do for these kids and their families. There's probably 10 big things that would matter in these schools. But I'm convinced, after the reporting and research I've done in the schools and with all the experts and gurus and teachers and superintendents I could find, is that if you could move one lever, the one that matters most is teacher quality. Now, the teachers' unions, and Sandy Feldman, the head of the AFT, and the teachers' union, their voices are all over the book as well. They'll be the first to say, and the first to worry about the fact that the nation is recruiting for its toughest schools from the bottom third of college classes today. That was not true in previous decades, in large part because up through the 60s and mid-70s, the quality of the teacher corps in urban America was subsidized by discrimination. Women and minorities didn't have as many opportunities outside the classroom. And so, as Sandy Feldman explains in the book, you have an enormous talent pool that is now on the cusp of retirement. All these well-known figures, 2 million teachers retiring, need to be hired the next decade, 700,000 in urban schools. All this talent is about to leave the teacher corps, and the counterparts of those people who are in college today or choosing careers are becoming, Kennedy School graduates and management consultants and doctors and .com executives. They're not becoming teachers. So if you compare most of these cities to their nearby affluent suburbs, the dynamic is always the same. The suburbs pay more, they have much nicer working conditions, if you've been in urban schools, and they have kids who come to school without any of the problems that typically in the big cities you have kids coming to school with. So when you've got, two close locations where you've got one with higher pay, better working conditions, and easier to teach kids, it's no surprise that over time the highest quality teachers are gravitating to the best suburban schools. Everyone knows that. It's also not to bash the urban teachers. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of teachers working their hearts out for these kids, and it's those kinds of teachers who have told me with horror how awful so many of their colleagues are and how they're blighting the lives of all these kids, where, if you're familiar with what happens, these kids can go from kindergarten through 6th grade every year with a brand new, green, untrained rookie who is not qualified to teach them. The research tends to show after a couple of years of that, you never catch up, and you can go through 6 years of that. What could be more unjust? Now, what would we do if we were going to be serious about this problem? To start, and we can talk more in the Q&A. I hope I don't have to spend a lot of time trying to convince you that No Child Left Behind actually doesn't do anything like what the title of that law implies, and that when it comes to teacher quality, which is the biggest issue, I would argue, for what we're talking about, it does zero. It does zero. And yet, Ted Kennedy cut a deal with George Bush, which gave Bush and Karl Rove the compassionate image that, we'll be seeing the White House signing ceremonies and Bush and Ted Kennedy shaking hands, and Karl Rove will blast that for $200 million worth next year to show that Bush is compassionate in ways that attract independent voters, which is essential to his reelection on the domestic side. But it did nothing in terms of teacher quality. Laura Bush does good work as a bully pulpit matter, trying to encourage people to go into teaching, but that is simply not equal to the size of the problem. The bully pulpit on this is just not enough. It's nice. I'm not diminishing what she's doing. but it's just not a serious response. The Democrats know they need to do better, but they don't offer anything like what I'm about to suggest would be what we'd do if we were serious. Richard Gephardt and John Edwards, for example, are putting together different kinds of teacher corps plans where you'd forgive tuition for kids who agree to go teach for 5 years, et cetera. It's better than nothing. It's better than the Bush plan. It doesn't do anything that would change the dynamics where an engineering grad is going to give up the $60,000 he can get in a high-tech firm and go earn $35,000 without rising much in a poor school. So, what would we do if we were serious? I believe a president, or it needs to be a presidential level initiative, some federal initiative, would come to the country and say, I'm going to raise the salaries of high poverty teachers 50% across the board. But that offer is conditioned on two fundamental reforms from the teachers' unions. First, the unions have to give up the lockstep pay scale. People know what that is? The way that almost all union contracts in major cities require that you pay a teacher based solely on the degree they have, bachelor's or master's, and the number of years they've been in the classroom, so that you have to pay a physics grad who's been teaching for 8 years roughly the same as a phys ed grad who's been teaching for 8 years. That's not to diminish the value of the phys ed teacher, but it's, see, I've been sensitized to these things, right? What it means is this requirement that they be paid identically is part of what fuels the severe shortages in math and science and special education, where people who have this background and training have more lucrative options outside the classroom. So the unions have to give up that pay scale so that in addition to the 50% across the board increase, I can raise the top half of the corps, or people in these shortage specialties, another 50% on average. And the unions have to give up the rules that make it almost impossible to fire the worst performing teachers, which the unions will be the first to say are blighting the lives of up to 10% of these kids. Now, if you do a plan like that in a city like LA where I live, or Boston or New York, it's roughly the same dimensions. Starting salary in LA today is $40,000. The maximum salary you can get as a teacher in LA, if you've been in class 25 years and somehow picked up a PhD, on nights and weekends along the way, is about $75,000. Under my plan, the starting salary would be $60,000. The top half of the teacher corps, best performers in shortage specialties, would earn $85,000 to $90,000 on average. The best teachers, not all teachers, the best teachers would earn $130,000, $140,000, $150,000 even. And the goal would be to say that the nation is going to make the best teachers of poor children millionaires over their careers. I believe that means they could put enough aside at those salaries to put $1 million in the bank to retire with. Now, I believe it's only something on that scale that will change the way college students view teaching as a career, and would begin to change the dynamic of, instead of recruiting from the bottom third of the class for these schools, we're going to recruit from the top third of the class. A plan like this would cost about $30 billion a year, kind of Title I for teaching. I'm happy to report that is one of the smaller ticket items in the 2% solution. $30 billion. $30 billion is a 7% increase in national K-12 spending. It would create, I submit to you, a 1,000% revolution in the way the career of teaching is viewed by young people choosing their career, which is the lever we have to face. So that gives you a feel of, I'm asking the left to give up the teachers' unions, as you know, the most powerful, arguably the most powerful interest group in the Democratic Party, that sends more delegates to the convention, the Democratic nominating convention, than the state of California, where I live, if you look at all the teachers' union delegates. So the unions have to be open to this negotiation, to changing, but in exchange, the conservative side has to put up the money to make what I'm talking about possible, but I'm trying to do it in a way that makes you spend the money sensibly. You can't give the increase to everyone equally. That's not a good use of scarce resources, as a Kennedy School analyst would say. So that gives you a feel for that, and in that, as in other areas, I'll do healthcare briefly, and then try and move toward discussion shortly, but it's in that chapter, I shop this idea among the superintendents like Roy Romer and Alan Burson and Arnie Duncan in Chicago and Harold Levy, the former New York guy. The teachers' unions are in there. Checker Finn, if you know, the conservative education reformer, to try and show, Rod Page, to try and show what the contours of a negotiation would need to sound like, and why there's reason to think you could make a deal like this. The reason that I think it comes out promising is that most of these so-called performance pay initiatives, anyone who looks at education stuff here, they've been pilots around the country, Denver, Cincinnati. They've largely failed, but the reason is there are these tiny little things that are $1,000 or $2,000 a year. Nobody has an incentive, and the unions really don't have an incentive to try and make it work. When you put $30 billion on the table, and talk about the increases that I'm talking about, including this base increase, that means that it's a win for every single person the union represents right out of the box, which conservatives don't like, it begins to change the dynamics in ways that I think would get us toward where we need to go. Let me give you a word on the healthcare thing to give you the same feel. The plan that I push in the book, and these are not, the book is full of ideas that are not all mine, but I'm trying to package in this 2% notion, the best ideas in ways that shows we can afford them. The healthcare plan I push, I call the Bill Bradley, George Bush Sr. healthcare plan. Now, why do I call it that? Remember, I just said before, Bradley had this plan, Bush had this plan in 1992 that would have covered 30 out of 35 million. Bradley's plan in 2000, in the 2000 primary, was very similar in ways, again, the press, talk about the press, did not explain. It was very similar to the one that Bush had. In fact, Bush's, if you adjusted it for inflation, was actually more generous than Bradley's in some ways. But recall that Al Gore savaged Bradley's whole idea of covering everybody as some utopian liberal dream. His staff trashed it as evidence of Bradley's reckless spending mentality. And yet, the same contours of refundable tax credit, essentially a subsidy or a voucher, you can call it what you want, it gets the money into the hands of mostly low-income workers and their families, which are the bulk of the 44 million uninsured, to let them buy a decent family plan at affordable group rates, can't be alone in the individual market, so it has to be regulated in that way, from among competing private insurers. That's the same dimensions of the plan that Bush had, that Bradley had, that Stuart Butler from the Heritage Foundation was one of the pioneers of 12 years ago, that the DLC on the Democratic side has been working with, and that in my view is the most pragmatic way to get to a kind of universal coverage American style. When my liberal friends say, but wait, you're keeping the private insurers in the game, we should have a single-payer Canadian thing, etc., I think we shouldn't. Not only will it never happen politically, I think it shouldn't happen substantively, and that's another discussion we can have if you want. But when my more liberal friends say, well, wait a minute, you're going to, with these private insurers, you're going to have 10, 20% lost off the top to HMO salaries and CEO salaries and their marketing and administrative expenses. I tell my liberal friends, look at it as a jobs program and you'll learn to love it. What do you care if there's, it's a time-honored tradition in American politics that a little money greases the skids to make things happen. If you stop the cherry-picking of the insurers, and the voice in the book that I feature a negotiation between Jim McDermott, single-payer advocate from Seattle, and Jim McCreary, who I didn't know before I researched the book, the most interesting Republican on healthcare in my view, besides Bill Thomas, who's obviously more prominent because he's the Ways and Means chairman. But Jim McCreary also on the Health Subcommittee of Ways and Means, Louisiana Republican, 90% conservative voting record. McDermott's 90% liberal, showing them how they can get their arms around a deal. McCreary says that you need to make health insurance more like a regulated utility over time. If you get the cherry picking out, I say to the left, and you get the money to people who need it to buy a plan, why do we care? Say yes. I mean, Ted Kennedy's sorry he didn't say yes to Richard Nixon 30 years ago, and the problem's gotten worse. So, again, shows you the kind of blend of liberal and conservative ideas I'm pushing, and we can talk more in Q&A about the living wage proposal I have, the campaign finance, and some of the others. Basically, what I'm doing in each of these things is trying to challenge folks on each side and others to do something that, again, is sort of an unnatural act given the way the current political discourse goes, which is to acknowledge what is right in the other side's worldview. Right? You don't actually hear that happen often, at least in public. In private, it actually happens all the time. And so I'm asking my Republican friends, for example, to give up the big government mantra that they wield like a club to attack my side of the debate at every turn. And what I say to them, and I understand, and we all understand the politics of that, but what I say to my Republican friends is 7 things make up 75% of federal spending. 7 things. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, military pensions, civil service pensions, defense, the Pentagon, and interest on the debt. Those 7 things are 75%. Republicans aren't trying to cut a dime of that. Republicans are calling for big increases in all of that. Republicans will double the national debt in the next few years and double the interest costs under George Bush's budget plan. And that's the big 7, that's 75%. Then you get to the last quarter on the dollar, and that's everything we think of as government, from the National Institutes of Health, you want a cure for cancer and other diseases, to NASA, had some bumps in the road, but people still support NASA, to student loans, to farm subsidies, to homeland security, all things that take up a goodly portion of the quarter on the dollar that's left and which Republicans vote for every day. So if you look at what Republicans say about big government and how they vote, the whole attack on big government is a pure pretense. Has to be exposed that way, and the press has to play a bigger role. I don't mean to make you the proxy. Isn't it time? The press has to play a bigger role. So that's what I'm asking that's what I'm asking my Republicans. The Democrats, I'm asking to challenge some of their traditional views. The teachers' union is an example. To challenge the teachers' unions, which I think is doable. To accept serious differentials in pay as the price of getting more money into the system to lure the teachers that we know we need and the kind of quality we need. I'm also asking the left, and this is a harder sell, to realize that it's liberals that need to take the lead on slowing the growth of healthcare costs and old age entitlements that are going to gobble up the federal budget once the boomers start to retire in just a few years. What I tell my liberal friends is that a decade from now, the enemy of the left is not the heirs to Newt Gingrich. A decade from now, the enemy of the left is Medicare. Because every dollar that goes to Medicare that it's not needed for quality care, and remember, we're at 14% of GDP, every other advanced nation is at 9% of GDP on health care. They cover everybody. We have 44 million out. We don't have demonstrably better health outcomes, so radical inefficiency in the health sector. Every dollar that goes to Medicare that's not needed for quality care is a dollar we cannot spend on a poor child. And that's what the budget trade-offs are going to sound like in a decade. And it's the left, therefore, that has to take the lead. The left resists everything. You know, they want a demagogue. You're seeing a whole intramural debate now among the Democrats because Gephardt wants to get traction against Dean and call him like Newt Gingrich. And, you know, they pilot the internal demagoguery on Medicare and Social Security that then they'll roll out against Bush next time, which I think is not only, it would be forgivable if it were effective, but it's ineffective, and it's also disastrous on policy because if liberals don't lead, liberals are the ones who want money, government money, for other purposes. Grover Norquist will be thrilled if Medicare and Social Security gobble up the budget and there's no money left for anything else and it's just a giant ATM machine. That's the federal government. Conservatives win then. And that's actually the direction it's going to go because it's all going to be on autopilot starting a decade from now. So it's the left that has to lead on that. And that's Bob Kuttner was not receptive to that argument when we did a think tank thing on this in Washington the other day. So it's going to be a debate. I'm asking the press to think differently about its role. And should I take 2 seconds on the press thing now? Here's my diagnosis of the press. You know, the conservatives are always conservatives are always saying, the press is liberal, the press is liberal, the press is liberal. And you know, in my view, based on personal experience, I think they're right. If you ask me, based on my personal experience, most national reporters at the major outlets lean left. But I don't think that's interesting. What's interesting is, if the press is so liberal, why has the political center of gravity in the country gone so far to the right in the last 2 decades? And the answer is that the coverage of our most influential national outlets is determined not by ideology, but by stenography. And let me explain what I mean by that, because some of my friends in the press, you can take offense to that. I don't mean it as a pejorative, I mean it totally descriptively. News on the kind of public policy issues we're talking about is defined by what public officials say and do. And therefore, the 50-yard line in American politics is the middle of the mainstream Republican position and the mainstream Democratic position. The 50-yard line is in the middle because these views are faithfully reflected and these boundaries are not challenged by the way the major outlets report the news. So, before 1994, Democrat Clinton is talking about universal health coverage and more money for the working poor, the ITC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the left is here, right is here, the 50-yard line's here. After 94, the Democrats go like this. They're scared. The Republicans look at that and say, wow, we can go over here. Let's eliminate the death tax. Let's eliminate the dividend tax. Let's cut even more marginal tax rates. And the 50-yard line went to here. All filtered through the same liberal press, accurately reflecting the polls of the debate. So, at the same time, and I was trying to think, what could I propose as a press innovation that would help raise public awareness and maybe make the world safe for some of the more adult political conversations we need? I was faced with some dilemma because when I was, and maybe other people have had this experience, when I was in business and then when I was in government, I used to always, cry to myself, how come the Washington Post isn't doing more about the uninsured, or how come the New York Times won't do more about the working poor? But the truth is, every good outlet can point to the 2-part series they did 13 months ago on that working poor fellow and the 3-part series they did 9 months ago on the uninsured. And if there is not news on these issues. No candidate making dramatic plans, no new initiative from a senator, no million-man march. They can't write a 3-part series every month on the front page of what I or anyone wants them to do. And so the struggle I had, or the challenge I was trying to answer wasn't there some way nonetheless, when neither party finds it convenient to talk about things, and the SNL crisis was a classic example, if you're old enough to remember that, where that was bubbling for years, no one talked about it, the whole presidential campaign, not a peep, and then it was the first thing Bush did, to his credit, George Bush, the father, after the election, and it sort of sprang like a bolt from the blue because there hadn't been a word about it from either side of the campaign because they were both in cahoots and didn't want to talk about it. Shouldn't there be ways that the most influential national media outlets, and that for me is page one of the Washington Post and the New York Times, because they play a unique role in our political culture. They set the agenda for the whole electronic media, for the coverage you get everywhere from the Boston Globe, the LA Times, etc. And shouldn't there be some way that they could regularize attention to these issues that are important, even though there is not news on them? Because what is important doesn't change every day, whereas the news does. And we want them to give us the news, the 7 most important things that happen every day on page 1. David will remember I had a long interest in this because when I was at U.S. News, I did a piece on how the New York Times puts page 1 together that I remember you edited skillfully at the end. But it's somewhat of a crisis, I think, at that time. And so what I went, and the whole chapter in the book that's on this sort of idea I have is hooked around a long interview with Len Downey, the editor of the Washington Post. And where I begin the conversation with these editors first is just to ask them how they put together page 1. How do they decide? And generally, what they would describe is there's hard news, bomb goes off in Baghdad, president makes a State of the Union address, obviously page 1 story. There's the offbeat yarn that kind of writes itself onto page 1, like a kind of thing Rick Bragg might have done when he was at the New York Times, on a Louisiana gumbo story or something with a good picture that they have in color now, but to merchandise the page. But beyond those things, there is often a discretionary hole where the editors have sent off their talented reporters for months of work, their investigative journalists, their explanatory journalists, etc., where they're exercising what Len Downey and the others will say is an exercise of power to put on the front page something that they've exercised their discretion to bring attention to an issue they think is important. David K. Johnston does a series on how the IRS is, New York Times is a series on how the IRS audits the working poor more than the rich. Or Kate Boo at the Post does that great series on abuses in mentally ill homes for the Washington Post, wins a Pulitzer. So there is some discretionary power there. Then I produce my mock-up of the page 1 feature I would like them to introduce, where what I'm proposing, and there's a mock-up in the book, and I pitched this to Len Downey and Bill Keller and all of them, is a feature that I call Still True Today. And it would be a tiny 2 lines, kind of a ticker tape, 2-line ticker tape at the bottom of the front page, 2% of the front page, where they would put the facts of on a set of issues that would be repeated repeatedly. And so, for example, if I were Donald Graham or the Sulzberger family, I know what I would do. Monday would be Health Day, and it would say, still true today, 40 million uninsured, U.S. spends 14% of GDP, everybody else spends 9%, they cover everybody, Medicare doesn't cover prescription drugs. Tuesday would be Education Day, 2 million teachers need to be hired in the next decade, average starting salary is $30,000, etc. Wednesday might be Working Poor Day, on and on. But every week, I'd be repeating those same facts. And so I pitch this to them as a way to, it doesn't touch 98% of the front page. They still do everything they need to do to bring us the news. But what about something like this as a way to institutionalize attention to the things that matter most and that are enduring problems? The general reaction, and you can read the long kind of discussion on this, and they really engaged, which I truly appreciated, was that this is too editorial, in quotes. And that's when I would say, when that was, for example, Len Downey's instinctive reaction, I would say, how is it different? How is it different from what you do when you send Kate Boo off for months to do that discretionary hole that you acknowledge as an exercise of power, has an impact on the public agenda, and is within your power? And there's a long back and forth on the nature of what some of the top editors in the country would say the differences are. But it comes down to, at the end, as Downey summed it up, in this phrase, it doesn't come organically out of the coverage of the news. To which I say in the book that seems to me a phrase that journalism seminars could chew over for years, because it sort of reminds you of the Clinton-esque cliche. It really comes down to what you mean by organic, by coverage, and by news. But that's where that discussion was. I'm still hoping, this is the whole discussion here is what Columbia Journalism Review is going to excerpt. The Sacramento Bee has already said they may want to pilot something like this. And I'm hoping this will start a discussion in the profession about the role that the top outlets ought to play. And Jack Schaefer at Slate's already slammed me as trying to revive public journalism, and I'm not into that debate. I'm not trying to have some big civic thing. I'm trying to have a couple of lines with facts on the front page, which I think, if that happened, would ripple through the political culture overnight. Maybe the conservatives will start doing their own sets of facts. Fine, but you'd have a change in the conversation. Electronic media can obviously adapt versions of this, etc. And the argument I try and make in the book is that if we get to the year 2015 or 2020, and we've got 60 million uninsured, and we still are a nation where the neediest kids in the country are systematically assigned to the least qualified teachers, and we still have tens of millions of families working full-time living in poverty. If all those things are true and we haven't addressed this stuff 10 years or 15 years from now, every institution that has power in this country should feel complicit in that failure. And that's not being a scold to say that that our most powerful media outlets are part of those sets of institutions that have power in the country and ought to feel at least some obligation to be involved in making the world safe for these kind of conversations. So lastly, let me close and we'll have a discussion, because I'm going to tax everybody's patience. I also ask in the book for citizens to get more involved. You talk about different challenges you might have, because we hear all these cries about the crisis of leadership, and there's no question that there's a lot of truth to that. But in my view, if we're honest, we have to admit there's a crisis of followership, which is another word for citizenship, and that democracy is a two-way street. That if people aren't willing to have a threshold level of engagement in public issues, I'm not saying busy moms and dads have to study up on domestic policy after they put the kids to bed at night. Although if they are inclined, I do have one book that I think will give them all they need to know on this stuff. But without some threshold level of engagement, we get the government we deserve. And in my view, and this is not a diminishing statement about politics, it's just the reality. The iron law of politics still holds. Politicians will scramble to lead any parade that forms. And the task of citizenship in a democracy is to organize the right parades so that it promotes the leadership we want. It's a virtuous cycle or a bad cycle. Good leaders and good followers reinforce each other. Bad ones create a spiral down. The press has a role in trying to make the good followership and citizenship possible that helps create good leaders. You could probably do a diagram and write a PhD thesis on some of this. So I ask citizens to be somewhat more involved. Obviously, and I'll wrap it up, as I shop this stuff, I heard plenty of naysaying the last few years. The unions won't accept it, the business won't get behind it, the politicians won't risk it, you can't reallocate the money, and this skepticism makes perfect sense given the poverty of the debate in the last decade. But I say to you, in the broad sweep of American history, of just in the sweep of events, the changes I'm talking about are literally small change. And when a country is just 2 cents on the dollar away from social justice and more economic growth, if we bring these folks into the mainstream, there are plenty of grounds for hope, especially if all of us play some role in creating the constituency that helps our leaders talk in different ways about really fixing this stuff. Thank you. And I know the other campaigns are looking at it. I didn't share all this stuff until the book was final, because it needed to have its own life. It couldn't come out and be, that's Gephardt's teacher plan or that's Kerry's ex. But obviously, I hope they will look at it and find it of interest. So.
But you have no direct connection so
Not
far.
Except that I know they're aware of it. So
Thank you. It was great.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you. Sorry to go on so long, but I'm happy to.
Alice will
talk.
take your message to Len Downing,
I
right?
will. Bill Keller too.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Paul.
Sure. Thanks a lot.
Okay, floor's open. Please.
Yeah, the question that runs through me, I've been reading the book, and it's fascinating, is you give a number of examples in the book of sitting down with individuals and discussing these things with them and bringing them to some kind of consensus on what really ought to happen. Can you point to a single real-life example in Congress where this has happened in the last 30 years?
Sure. I mean, tons. I mean, welfare reform, the Balanced Budget Act in '97, the children's health thing in '97, which again not equal to the problem, but they came together and put $25 billion out over 5 years that insured a bunch of kids, not as many as they should have, but I think it happens all the time.
But those are really small compared to what you're proposing here.
You're right, but I think that's because the debate, I mean, you're right, but the debate has been at the edges because since '94, the Democratic side of the debate has been so timid. And I think in our system, and I think the dynamics are shaping up on the domestic side, that it will be a bigger debate about fundamental things because on healthcare at least, all the Democrats are thinking bigger than they were last time. Al Gore was only talking about insuring children. Demagogue Bradley and won the nomination, though he was more ambitious. Most of the leading Democrats are talking bigger on health care, and in ways that I think will join that debate more closely.
I think you could also point to the tax reform of '86 that Bill Bradley led, which was a massive overhaul of the tax code. Nobody thought it could be done. And possibly the Social Security reform in the early '80s with Greenspan.
Thanks.
Am I fun?
I was just going to say, I have lived in the UK for the last 4 years, so I totally agree about healthcare, and I've seen a system that works and has spent far less, and that was great. And regarding your press statistics, I don't know if anyone suggested, but rounding out the bad news with good news, number of new businesses created, percentage of people graduating college, it seems like that's always missing from reporting in general. We report on gun violence, but we don't report on good deeds, so that's my idea. My main point was the two premises you started with, the evening out for luck and the basic standard of living for families. I wonder if that second point is, I don't know that that's a generally agreed upon value. I feel like this myth of the American dream is so powerful that people value the right to propel yourself to great wealth and talent over the right of everyone to have a basic standard of living. And I don't know, I feel like that's such a powerful vision for the common man and for the working class as well, that even to get agreement on those two fundamental principles is difficult because that obscures that goal.
I guess I don't, a couple quick thoughts, I guess I don't see them as incompatible. I don't want to take away the American dream of vaulting as hard, as high as your skills and ambition and luck and et cetera can take you. But at the same time, we already have a rough consensus on lots of things. We have Medicaid. The uninsured are sort of an anomaly. They're the working poor. The people, if you're too poor, if you're poor enough, you get Medicaid. And otherwise, you get it from an employer, mostly. If you're old, you get it from Medicare. And so there's this anomaly where we've kept 44 million people out of the system. Everyone knows it's a problem. And Milton Friedman will say it's a problem. I had a piece in the Boston Globe Sunday Ideas section last weekend, excerpting some of the luck stuff, and people like Friedman say it's crazy that you have 40 million uninsured. And Ed Gillespie says in the book, the new chairman of the Republican Party, says, I don't think you get a disagreement from conservatives about everyone needing basic health coverage, that it's the means by which you do it that is the question. And so I would like to hold him to that, but of course he would then have to give up the constant tax cutting because you'd have to have money to actually do it. What was the rest of the question?
That's it,
That's
really.
close enough? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm convinced that the major reason we haven't addressed the kinds of issues that you brought up today is due to the way that we finance political campaigns in America. So I'm interested in your ideas for campaign finance reform.
The idea that I showcase in the book, and it's not my invention, is from Bruce Ackerman, a Yale law professor, and it's called Patriot Dollars. And what the problem it answers is, in my view, just to sort of as a preface, McCain-Feingold, in my view, could never have solved the problems that really ail us, and became great virtue, and McCain's great achievement was to show there's a constituency for discussing this, especially at the New York Times editorial page. Now, the fact that it became this crusade, even though it wasn't going to fix the problems that, because it doesn't have public financing in it, and because it doubled the hard money, people are familiar with that. It was the George W. Bush Re-election Act, and George W. Bush knew that when he signed it, because that's what creates the $200 million, bankroll. But still showed there could be a constituency for movement on these issues. I guess I'm convinced that you can't solve the problem without public financing. I'm also convinced that as a practical matter, you can't, and maybe as a matter of good policy, that public financing that's administered by central bureaucrats somewhere in Washington, doling out, who gets what, will never be acceptable to conservatives. What Ackerman proposes is to give every voter, every election cycle, a $50 essentially voucher he calls Patriot dollars that would be administered through ATM machines that would inject in a grassroots empowering way. You could give that $50 to the Sierra Club, to the NRA, to Howard Dean, to whoever you want. And in the last election cycle, there was $3 billion in private money. You wouldn't touch private money. Private money has to be fully disclosed, fully instantly disclosed, etc. But otherwise, you don't touch it. $3 billion in private money last election cycle. The Ackerman thing would do, if you take $50 times about 100 million voters last time, inject $5 billion. He would always keep it a little higher on the public money, on the theory that there should be a little more public money determining the discourse in elections than private money. But that avoids the whole Buckley versus Vallejo constitutionality problem, which, whether you think Buckley was right or wrongly decided, changing it's a big deal and very hard. So leaves the private money in the system, but creates a way for people, if they want to fully finance their campaigns in a public way through this grassroots way of empowerment. And Chris Shea says in the book, this is interesting, maybe it would open up the way conservatives look at public financing. Might be nice to try it in some states, to which Ackerman says, how about California? So it would be interesting. So that's basically the plan that I push.
I think this is a great effort. I think it's hard to think of another book that this book is debating to some degree, and that's a sort of sad statement about public dialogue at the moment. So I think the fact that the book is sort of pragmatic in the way that you talk to the people who are going to need to be involved in making these things happen is good. I have one small suggestion, which is that I agree with the lady over there that the luck equal opportunity rationale I don't think is the best starting point, because I think it takes us back to that very old debate about sort of how socialized the individual is. This is where Rawls gets hit by Nozick. The whole debate about the undeserving poor essentially comes down to this free will determinism question. People really responsible.
Which is where Friedman brings it in the book, by the way. I didn't mean it, but it's fascinating. Friedman ends up saying, well, this is really about free will versus determinism. And I said, well, I believe in free will. And he goes, well, I'm not sure. I said, Milton Friedman, free to choose, Milton Friedman. Isn't sure about free will. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just Friedman's a great guy. He's a great kind of guy like that. So anyway, I think that at least listening to your rhetoric, I find it more convincing when you talk about impending crisis with Social Security, when you talk about the trade-off with teachers' unions. I think if you were to sort of poll, since what you're trying to do here is get buy-in to your ideas,
right.
If you were to poll, should I start with this rationale or should I start with my pragmatic solutions, I suspect you would get more support on the latter.
Yeah, those are all fair points, and you should know I'm not looking for presidential candidates to start with John Rawls on the stump, but I do want, at least in the book, want to lay out where I found the inspiration to try and think about this stuff, and to show, which I try and show in that chapter, as I allude to, that you can reconcile Milton Friedman's political economy on these issues with Rawls's. I mean, Friedman's the godfather of the earned income tax credit. Friedman's concerns about luck drove him to want the decent minimum. The debate's about where it is. That's what the country should debate. I mean, I'm talking about a subsidized, a living minimum wage of $9 to $10 an hour. I should have hit that. I didn't hit that. The whole problem. You want 2 seconds on the living wage debate? No? The problem with the living wage debate is the left is totally right about the injustice facing unskilled workers, in my view, but totally wrong about the economics of fixing it. So you've got these ordinances now in 80 cities around the country. I support them symbolically for raising the issue, in my view, back to the federal level where alone it can be solved. And the problem is, which I try and explain to the left, is that you cannot sustainably solve this problem by mandating that employers pay $10 an hour or more plus health care, something like that, for people who in economic terms, I'm talking about individual moral worth and human dignity, but who in economic terms are worth $6 an hour to that employee. If you do that, you create these perverse effects that hurt the people you're trying to help. Small businesses are going to swap out. They're going to fire the $6 guys and hire the $10 guys because they do more for them. And so the only way you can do this is, in the plan that I push in the book, is something that an economist named Ned Phelps from Columbia University put out in a book a few years ago called Rewarding Work, 1997 book. It's kind of a mega EITC. And we already have the EITC. That's about $35 billion a year, earned income tax credit, wage supplement. Phelps's plan, which he would actually do through the employer, is $85 billion on top of that. Now, when I shop that to the various folks in politics in the debate, a senior Bush economic advisor in the White House said, "Oh, if we were serious, we would do something like Phelps's plan." But of course, it's $85 billion. We can't do that. Well, that's less than a penny on my 2 cents on the dollar. So the whole 2% idea is try to, again, package things so that you're saying you can show it's not a revolution. It's this. Sorry, that was a living wage detour. I want to go to other people who haven't talked to it. Sure.
How is, being practical, how is your plan going to be affected by this whole Iraq situation? I mean, isn't that going to make the politicians very, very hesitant about spending any more money?
This plan won't get enacted in the next year. There's no question. The Iraq thing will not last more than a couple of years. And I think on the long-term basis, that is not something that would cause a problem with doing something like this. Whatever you think of the war.
There's another example of how far the country has changed in the last 30 years or so. I remember WIC, Women, Infant, Children's Feeding Program, enacted by Richard Nixon, and every child under the age of 5 and every lactating mother was guaranteed, a certain nutritional benefit. They were guaranteed food. And we started means testing that within the Reagan administration, and it keeps on being pared down. And I don't think it's possible within this political climate to do that again, because right now we hate children and will continue to hate children for the reasons that you've talked about, because people my age and older are going to be wanting all the bennies. The other thing is that because of the political situation, I've been thinking about rereading Dwight Eisenhower's favorite book, Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. So we have a political climate in which there are only true believers. There can only be true believers. And I'm wondering, within that political climate, how are you looking at extra-political, non-political means? And you talked a little bit about the media, but talk about other extra-political and non-political means to bring your ideas to the fore, to form a constituency, perhaps through the private sector, public-private partnerships, something like that. Because I think that's necessary in order to break this deadlock.
Well, a couple of thoughts. I guess first, this ultimately doesn't move forward without politics. And the other sort of variant on the question you asked that I get often asked from Democratic groups is, I did a policy salon in Washington the other night with Rosa DeLauro and her husband Stan Greenberg, who have a thing with about 15 Democratic House members. Boy, you've never met a more depressed group than House Democrats in the minority. And their objection, which I'll tie back to your thing, their question is, what do you mean you want us to cut deals with these guys? We try to do a little bit of this on the child tax credit. We try to do a little of this every time we give them an inch. That boom, they nail us and we're dead and blah 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 blah.
Yeah, talks to Max Cleveland.
And right, and so I should be clear. I view this. It's for reasons of sound policy and for sustainability. As I said at the outset, I think that changes like this in our social commitments have to be passed by votes of 70 to 30, not 51 to 49. That's why the book has the solutions it has. But as a political matter, I have a partisan side to me as well. And while this book fits totally with the compassionate rhetoric of George W. Bush, it's obviously not. He's had a few years and he's shown zero interest in actually trying to make good on some of the stuff. So you can think of the book in that sense as the magnanimous terms of surrender that would be imposed by a triumphant Democrat who cleans Bush's clock in 2004. I see this being implemented under Democratic leadership, but a Democrat who's trying to find sustainable ways to move this forward. Now, I guess I think this has to be translated into. I don't have a full plan for how you create the constituency for this stuff. I'm trying to begin by injecting the book into the debate, telling people to go to the website 2%solution.com, spelled out TWO%solution.com, where I'm asking people to sign up if they want to stay in touch, get my column weekly, and when I figure out exactly what we should do, you'll be notified and you can begin to lead the army here in Cambridge that's trying to do this. But I'm trying to speak to business groups and reach out to them. I think the business, there's been such a loss because of the whole changing nature of the CEO job and the just the changing nature of it in the last 20 years, there's been a real loss of business leadership as a constituency for the public interest as opposed to a constituency for their private parochial interests. And that's a tremendous loss because anything all these kinds of changes require business support because they're so important in the society. And so I'm going to be talking to a lot of business groups and hope to reach out to them and hopes. I mean, the kind of early reaction I get is there's a positive response to a kind of pragmatic problem-solving approach that gets past some of the charades that appeals to them. So I'm going to try and bring in as many people into the umbrella. The precise form that takes, I don't know yet.
Follow-up, Kit?
Sure.
Are you talking to union groups as well?
Yeah, I had the Economic Policy Institute, which is a union-oriented think tank. Larry Michel, the president there, hosted a lunch for me the other day with a room full of people who were intrigued and who like a lot of the goals. They don't fully like all the means because, for example, on the living wage, I'm saying that you can't put the full burden of a living wage on employers. That cuts against the grain of subsidizing employers to do what they ought to do in their view on their own. And I make counter arguments that there's a bunch of industries where it's never going to be where the industry is by its nature kind of low margins and low profit. It's not a question of whether organizing can solve that problem and share the pie better. There's some places where you're just going to have, if you want to have a living wage that actually works. I mean, the whole problem with the living wage debate, as I was saying, is after 10 years or so of these 80 ordinances, it now covers perhaps 250,000 people in the country. There are 25 million people at near poverty level wages. So if we wanted to, again, get serious, it has to be at the federal level supplementing that.
One comment on one sort of question, going back to originally your point about sort of starting with luck. Perhaps another way to start is to sort of frame it in the context of competing values in America. One being the strong value of freedom, and then the other very strong value of equality. Mm-hmm. And I think that the political spectrum can be sort of seen along that orientation as well. And rather than sort of being so divided on it, trying to have a paradigm shift where we see them as complementary values, and that we value both equality and freedom. And I mean that can complement the luck sort of argument as well. And then the question, I guess, is, I'm very much interested in all the things you had to say. With all due respect, you can't do it alone.
I know that.
And sort of run this crusade. And so I'm interested in the kind of institutions that you see as being very, conducive to this message. And also with regard to the parties, I think that they're ultimately, because of the bipolarity of the situation, that they're inevitably going to be driven to their extremes. And you may have, sort of exceptions that you guys listed, welfare and balanced budget. But overall, in sort of a consistent basis, this kind of sort of almost revolutionary public policy shift is going to be very difficult. And I'm interested in what your thoughts on sort of boldly, a third party of the Senate that is able to negotiate these kind of compromises that the Reform Party could have done, but failed to do, and more historically, the Bull Moose Party or Progressive Party.
Couple thoughts. I guess and this is all tentative because I don't know the full answer, but early thoughts on this. I think the Perot in '92 played a tremendous role in proving the constituency existed to care about the deficit, and it changed what Clinton did when he got into office. And I do think I think it's Richard Hofstadter's line that third parties, what is it? The function of third parties is to sting like a bee and then die. But that's a very vital contribution because it changes the nature of the debate and then injects the ideas that get co-opted, which I think is inevitable. Now, would there be a third party that would want to pursue stuff like this? I don't know. I'd like to see another Perot-ish figure start talking about the deficit again because what Bush has done is so reckless. Would there be? It'd be great if there was a third-party movement of the working poor, but that has proven, people a lot smarter than I have tried to figure out how to organize the people who would benefit from these kind of policies, and it hasn't worked very well. So in some sense, I mean, John McCain's political advisor, Rick Davis, who I talked to in the book, said that this is not something, this kind of agenda is not something that's going to be a grassroots up like the civil rights movement. Something like this will actually have to be embraced by elites of one kind or another. Politicians who want to come together, the business community that wants to say, you know, we have a bunch of human capital outside the mainstream that we need to bring in ways that my guess is have to be, and it has to end up somehow in the parties we have now. So, in terms of specific institutions, I don't know the full answer. A 2% club on the Kennedy School campus would be a start, you know, but I don't know beyond that yet. I'm open to ideas.
It's 1:30. Why don't we have one more question?
A comment and a question. First, I think there's one other change in the media since the 80s when David was in the White House and I was on Capitol Hill, and that is the press that we dealt with then really got into the policy of the issues as opposed to just the process that was going on. And I think what's happened is we now engage in sound bites from the two extremes. So when you're dealing with the media, I'd like to see you push for more Robert Payers of the world. I mean, I think he may be the only remaining reporter from that period who still has a beat that is focused on policy, Medicare.
I will do that. I think you're right.
What's your question?
Well, that was the...
Good. Okay, well, we finished right 1:30. I don't know if you want to stay and talk to people. I think, but I can tell you, it's for a school where people are running hither and thither. You know, have to make 14 other things. This is a remarkably faithful turnout that stayed till 1:30. Others have to go off to class. But all of us are deeply appreciative of you coming, and we wish you well. And 2%solutions.com, is that where it is?
2%solution.com.